Welcome to the Tracking Connections podcast, and thanks for listening.
We feature voices from around the world sharing stories of working intentionally with deep nature connection in ways that transform lives, families, projects, and communities. I'm Sarah.
I'm Aidan.
And I'm John.
And we are your hosts from Living Connection First.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of Tracking Connections, the podcast for Living Connection First. I'm Sarah, and I'm here with John and Aidan, and I'll pass it over to John.
Well, hi. Thanks for tuning in. Very excited about this podcast series, where we're going to collect stories from around the world where people practice connection first principles. And, whether they're talking about their deep naturalist nature connection journey or their holistic tracking journey, or how they're working with 512 project videos, or how they're utilizing Eight Shields principles. All of it is interesting to me and us. And, we're really looking forward to having my son Aidan on here today, who basically was born into a constructed culture based on these principles. And, Aidan's going to talk a little bit about how he uses Eight Shields in a very unique way outside of nature connection, as a context, and we want people to think, well, these principles are useful for many things. But I thought first, Aidan, we'd love to hear a little bit about what you remember from being born into, this culture that was created by Ingwe and myself and the families that were around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the earliest pictures of me is a picture of me in a cradle board camping in the snow in the Pine Barrens. I was born in November, so I imagine I was probably 3 months old or so when that picture was taken. And, just growing up from the very beginning, being out in nature and that just being normal all the time, and in a lot of ways, I don't really know the difference. And I think about, I'm the oldest of six, but I have two sisters who are closest to me in age. And when we discuss things out in nature, I don't know that they would necessarily tell you that they were really into nature and that they haven't chosen to pursue nature professionally in any way, where I definitely got very into it from a pretty young age and into my teenage years. And, I've taught nature programs in a lot of different contexts for the last 25 years. But I don't think either of them would tell you they have any, quote, nature background. But for us, it's just sort of a given that what the bird was that just flew by, or you know what plant that is. And not only do I know what plant that is, but yeah, of course I know that's chickweed. I eat it all the time, and you just kind of casually interacting with nature I think the best way to put it is in just sort of of course I do this kind of way. When you think about the idea of being natural, I think one of the elements of being natural is that it's not contrived, it's not thought of, it just sort of happens naturally, right? And so I think that would be a really good way to describe my relationship to nature connection growing up. Is it was so natural, it was just so much part of the flow that it was invisible to me. And the first time that I really started to have an awareness of my own depth of nature connection was actually when I started formally doing the Kamana Program when I was 15, 16 years old. And I was doing the work, and I realized that it all felt like review to me, because it was basically all the work that I had just sort of done through the course of getting to know things in my backyard growing up, So that was kind of how it happened for me to begin with. And then, being around the art of mentoring and being around sort of all these principles being put into action, especially once we moved to Western Washington and we were in the Seattle area, just being around all kinds of workshops and serving on acorns and helping out in different ways, as young as 12, 13 years old, to the point where I was, in leadership positions as a teenager. And so I was fortunate to kind of get steeped in this, and I just had a blast with it, and I think it has informed my thinking about sort of everything that I've designed, to this day, even when my work was not nature-based.
Well, I have a question for the listener out there who just had like this weird mind's eye image of you sitting on an acorn. And they were wondering, well, why would he sit on an acorn?
Yeah, well, and the acorn is just a term that was used for essentially a team. I mean, it was essentially teams that we would use to run workshops, but the idea was named an acorn because an oak tree grows out of an acorn. And so you have this design that has incredible growth potential, and is based on the Eight Shields principles, which we'll get into at various times, maybe today and certainly over the course of this podcast. So.
Yes, Sarah, I noticed, we're all three of us are fortunate today to be sitting in Badger Dig Studios, which, means basically we're kind of all in the same building in our different rooms. But I noticed you taking notes, and you've had a few and nods along the way. Is there anything you want to reflect or on what you heard or ask Aidan a question here?
Well, it's funny. My notes were actually the flower of life I was drawing. Which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a series of spheres or circles when you draw them, but that represent interrelatedness and the seed of life. And you're talking about the acorns, and I was just reflecting on the depth of what it means, what an acorn means, what a seed means, and what, how life sprouts out of that natural design. And just kind of reflecting on how the natural design designing with natural cycles has that quality of just very natural, organic, and ingenious growth. But yeah, I'm loving hearing the conversation, and so curious about Aidan being John's son and growing up in this culture that most of us did not have the opportunity to experience, and how it was an invisible learning, and invisible, you didn't know that it was different, right? It was just very normal for you. So I'm curious about the point where you may or may not have delineated, exactly what's happening here, as far as, the principles being as the way we now kind of unpack it for people, so that people that don't have it naturally can learn how to get it in their body. Was that a point for you of being like, oh, okay, this principle, I see how that's a thread now through my whole life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I was, I could say I was fortunate, but the truth is I just was tagging along, right? So, but I was in the back room for a lot of design conversations as well, right? And then I was, participating in there, listening in a workshop, sometimes presenting in a workshop even, or going and playing music in front of the crowd. And so in these workshops, people were learning about the principles. So I'm hearing the story of how Tom, taught my dad, when he was 10, and the story of the turtle. And I think I could probably tell those stories, almost word for word, some of them, because I've heard them so many different times. And so it's a weird space to be in, because it's like it's happening to me naturally, and I have awareness of the design that's behind it. But when you're in it, it's still happening naturally, right? So you'd have a moment where you'd pause and go, wait a minute, are they using art of questioning on me or whatever? But I will also say that, to the credit of the people that mentored me and worked with me, I'm sure that they were probably kind of hip to that idea, and basically like, this isn't going to work with Aidan if you are too ham-fisted with this or too heavy-handed, right? Like there still has to be a naturalness there, and it has to kind of flow. And I think that's the thing that's so powerful when you start to understand the natural learning cycles and you see how they flow. It sort of doesn't matter if you're privy to it or not, because inspiration flows in to getting motivated, to getting your hands on it, getting oriented, which flows naturally into hard work, right? And then flows into that internalization and celebration and processing of it, right? And so the cycle continues round, and you could be aware of the cycle, but it just feels good to be in that cycle, right? So even if you're aware of its existence, when you're actually engaging in it, it just feels really great. And so, and the next piece just, you've worked really hard and you really feel like you need a rest. well, guess what? That's next on the menu, like that, and that's what's so beautiful about it, I think. So so yeah, I definitely had a lot of awareness. It really got interesting when I started to think about design on my own, right? That was when
Mm-hmm.
it started to get interesting, was, okay, wait, now I'm responsible for something of my own. I'm, not part of the group, but I'm actually generating the group. And now I go, okay, what were these principles again? And I think that's actually, we're going to get into sort of some of the other ways to apply this, but I think that to me is what makes sort of Eight Shields principles, designing with natural cycles, so powerful, is its ability to be a diagnostic tool as well as a design tool to look and say, hey, how is this plan going to work? Is it lined up with the natural flow that it needs to have? And you can really anticipate where the challenges might crop up if you don't have quite enough of the right ingredients in there, right? So it's I think there's a lot of power there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. That's a great question, Sarah, too, because I think for the average um, person who might have been in Aidan's shoes, let's just say, right, where it's just natural what's happening, this nature connection thing is just happening. Um, it's not the case that if children were just left to their own devices and just played outside, that they would get as deep on the journey as Aidan got, or his sisters, because there's a layer in between that we're not talking about today, but we will get to in other conversation. For instance, if you check out the Living Connection First website and you find the Nature as Mentor piece, you'll hear an interview with me and Dan Gardoki, which maybe we'll move over to this podcast series so you have access to it. Because Dan, he was a teenager when I started mentoring him, and I took him on the nature connection journey. The first thing he got interested in was bird language. And, to this day, we teach bird language together. And it's been, I don't know, 30 plus years anyway, that Dan and I have been working together. But there was a point when Dan was kind of the late teens where he woke up one day and realized, oh my God, what John did for me, right? I was basically doing for Dan what Tom Brown did for me. I woke up to what Tom did for me when I was probably 17, 18. And Dan woke up to what I had done for him invisibly, what Ingwe and I had done for Dan invisibly. And he came to me one day and he said, I just realized what you did and I just appreciate it so much. Is there anything I can do for you? And I said, well, I got this son. And I'd really like him to go deep on the nature connection journey, but I don't want him to know that I'm asking you to do that. He said, okay, and as he said, we had a meeting recently, we were working on doing some work on updating the naturalist training program, Dan and Sarah and I and Josh Lane. And I mentioned that to Dan in the context of our meeting, and Dan just sort of laughed and he said, yeah, I played a lot of baseball with Aidan. Right. And that's how it is. It's like the mentor doesn't want to lay out their card deck and doesn't want the person they're mentoring, especially when they're children, to know there's a plan behind it. And that was something that Ingwe emphasized from back in 1983. We can keep score on where they're going and what they're learning, but we shouldn't let them know. And we'll just see, okay, they don't know enough about birds. Let's find a way to cleverly get them more interested in birds. Oh, they don't know enough about low-growing plants. Let's get them cleverly moving in that. But let's make sure it feels like a total adventure, their discovery. Let's cue off of their interest and not enforce a curriculum on them. We'll know what we'd like them to discover, and we'll bring them into exposure. We'll ask a few questions, we'll play some games, and we'll hope that they basically bite the hook, so to speak, like you're fishing for them. And then you catch them and then you get them moving and then they become intrinsically motivated to study more plants, right? So this is a model which we call coyote teaching or coyote mentoring. And, I wrote a book with Evan McGowan and Ellen Haas, who Ellen is really credited for pulling that book together and putting most of the research into it. Evan and I were just storytellers, really. But, the deal of what Ellen captured was she watched me working with children and she said, how did you know to do that with that child right in that moment? That was brilliant. I never would have thought to do that. And I'd look at her and I'd say, what moment, what child?
Mm.
I didn't know what she was referring to. And she'd say, oh, back there with that little, boy, Billy, he was going over here and you asked him a question and pointed at something. And all of a sudden he became really engaged. And then you kind of showed him something and asked him another question. And then he went off for a half hour on his own and he just did this incredible deep dive into that. Like, how did you know to do that? And quite honestly, what I can say is that I think I was just doing what Tom did for me unconsciously. Like, and I think that's the beauty of it. Once it's in place, it will move to the next generation without anyone having to tend it. But if you don't know it's there, you won't notice it. And children are just stoked to be involved with adults that are super interested in catching their stories and having a plan for them to connect with every single thing in nature, like that, kids have the instinct, but they don't have the plan, so they need the plan from the aunts and uncles and the grandparents to help that take root. And that's kind of what this is structured on. So that's the middle piece that we're not talking about here. But we'll get into that in other podcasts in a lot of different ways. But I really wanted to zero in on what Aidan has done with Eight Shield's principles in designing with natural cycles, using it in a way that we haven't talked about yet.
Right on. Well, the place where I spent a good 18 years designing programs and running programs had a nature component, but it also had an athletic fitness training component, and it also had a music and the arts component to it. And I was running the arts program for about a decade there. And one of the first things that came to me as I was an intern in this nonprofit in all these different areas is, what on earth do athletic training and music and nature have in common? Because they seem just completely disparate from one another. But what I found was that there was actually a lot more in common than I thought there was originally. And in this particular way, which is that I think in a lot of academic pursuits, you can sort of fake being the expert, right? We're talking about concepts, we're talking about ideas, and we can kind of go around them, we can philosophize, and we can get into them. And you can sort of hide the fact of whether or not you can actually use these ideas in principle. But with guitar, if you can't play a G chord, you can't play a G chord. And if you can play a G chord, you can, and everybody notices. And it doesn't matter how much music theory you know. You can play, and everybody's going to want to play along with you. And the same thing is true in athletic fitness. It doesn't matter how much you know about the theory of throwing a baseball. You can either throw a baseball or you can't, right? You can either lift the weight or you can't. You can either, do the jump or you can't. And then the same thing is true in nature, which is, you can read every book there is about bird language, but if you walk out and the birds fly away, you're not doing bird language at that point, right? You don't understand it. And so nature, as the mentor, it reflects back to you where you are in your journey. And I think that's in a really, really beautiful way. I started to discover that music and fitness training actually did the same thing, right? They kind of mentor you in your ability to actually do it. And then that also means that anybody can do it. If you can do the G chord, you can do the G chord and you're ready for the next chord, right? So it made me curious about whether I could take Eight Shields principles and design using these same cycles in music and whether it would work. And I have two sort of areas I want to share. The first one I'll use is just this classic problem that happens when you're teaching music, which is that the kid, usually I think the story goes something like this. Tommy turns 11 and has mentioned that he's interested in guitar. And so Tommy's parents get him a guitar for his 11th birthday and they sign him up for guitar lessons. And Tommy walks into that lesson with his brand new guitar and doesn't know what he's got himself into whatsoever. And, and he has no idea. All he really knows is that guitar seems cool, right? And in a typical setting, it's very easy to approach that just like school. And then the next thing you know, Tommy has guitar class on top of math class, on top of reading class, and he's just got another set of homework to add. And not only does Tommy not really get better at the guitar, but he also walks away from it going, well, I'm not doing that music thing anymore. right? And I had so many students that came to me that were either that, or they were already on their second try, where they were like, well, I'm going to try guitar because I tried piano, but my teacher was really strict and I really didn't like it. And so I, decided I'm going to quit piano, but maybe guitar will work for me, right? But what they were really saying was, you didn't do anything to build the connection for me to understand why I would be interested in learning guitar or piano or music. All you did was give me work. And so you skipped some steps. And so in the natural learning cycle, right, we have to start with inspiration, and then you can get some motivation, and then you can get to hard work. And so my approach to music lessons, and I had a ton of success doing this, was basically, if I didn't see evidence of motivation and hard work already, I did nothing but inspiration. And so we would do lessons where it was just, what are you interested in? What do you want to do? Okay, great, let's do that. And we would just do all these really short, exciting, inspirational lessons, and the kids would learn. I mean, if you looked at their lesson log, it'd be like, this is so random. Why'd you learn a Green Day song and then go over here and do this and do that? Where are your scales? Where's your music reading? Where's this? Where's that? But actually it was that I just knew there was no hope of them progressing with the quote boring stuff until they were hooked on guitar. So that was what I did, and I over and over and over again got kids hooked on music, and then they would get really good, and I sent people to Berklee School of Music that way.
That's incredible. So Aidan is referring to, the natural learning cycle. He's basically saying, if he sees them show up and they don't have motivation and they don't have hard work, so that would basically be going from, step 3 backwards, right? Okay, they're not working hard already. They didn't show up working hard and want to work hard. That's the 3rd step. If you go back a step, that's where they're motivated to actually do stuff. And then the step before that is inspiration, because now if we follow it forward, there's inspiration followed by motivation. So build up enough inspiration, then you get motivation. If you build up enough motivation, then they'll focus and actually learn the chords, or they might be motivated to learn a scale. And then with enough of those 3 coming one right behind the other over and over again, then they start to become embodied, which is when it starts to show up and look natural. That's when you say, oh, she's a natural musician or he's a natural singer, right? But that you miss those other 3 over and over again, right? And can we go back one more step? Because I have a question about this, right? Because if you go backwards from step 1, which is east or sunrise, right? That inspiration point archetypally, what comes before that is pre-dawn, which we often associate with vision, right? And the vision in the Tommy story is, oh, Tommy mentioned he would like to play the guitar, so we got him a guitar for his 11th birthday. So there's the vision, right? But the vision isn't well thought out and it's not well developed. So what do you do with that? Because that even predates the sunrise itself, which is where inspiration kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, my vision was, I'm going to do everything I can to help this kid fall in love with music. And because there's evidence there, right? There's evidence there that maybe they love music. That's why they got the guitar. That's why they showed up. So I want to feed that seed. I want to water that seed and see if that grows into something, right? And everybody's journey with music is going to be different. I mean, there were plenty of people that when it really came down to it, they actually weren't that interested in doing the hard work that it would take to become, a potential, professional musician, but they learned 5 chords and they had fun doing it. And that's great too, So I think maybe you could even go further and say, my vision is to find out what it is that they love about music and where they want to go with it. But along the way, I'm trying to do everything I can to foster their love of music and have that be the basis for it growing into, potentially a really, really, important skill that, the thing that you'll hear musicians, people who become lifelong musicians of any sort of level, they don't have to be, professional level musicians. They can, know 3 chords and play in their living room, and that's fine. But how many people do we hear, they talk about the importance of music in their life? Like this becomes something that can be a companion for you through your whole life, which again, just like nature connection, and in fact, just like having a practice, a physical practice, right? I was calling it athletic fitness, but really we're talking about any sort of physical practice. People talk about their martial arts practice or their yoga practice or all these different physical practices and how those become like companions that shepherd you along and help you have, a connection to something that feeds a part of yourself, right? I always thought sort of mind, body, and spirit maybe is what's being fed by those three elements. And when you put them together, they have they many people have a relationship to art or artistic expression, have a relationship to nature, have a relationship to their bodies, right? And their physical practice, and that all three of those things are I think it wouldn't be a stretch to say that they become essential for well-being.
Mm. Yeah, cool. This is so inspiring for me. I'm curious about musicians, maybe they've been clients of yours or not, but that have been with music and have some embodied skill. They've been through the inspiration phase, the motivation they've learned, right? So maybe they're 5 or 10 years into their music. And you had used the term diagnostic. So what if you see one of those using the principles as diagnostics? So you see this person that really knows how to play the instrument, but there's maybe not something coming through, or maybe they're saying, I haven't really learned anything new in a couple of years here. Like, how do you handle that kind of situation?
Well, that's a great question. I think that leads to the second part of what I wanted to share, which was actually the next piece on the learning flow, right? We get to celebration. Well, one of the ways that we built that into our program is that we had monthly concerts, and every month there were some of our students were performing in concert, and we figured out that because we were teaching guitar and bass and drums and piano and voice, and we had all these different instruments happening in the same place, we actually had this opportunity where when that student finally learned their favorite Green Day song, it would be easy for us to go up there, and it would be like maybe me and the student together sitting by ourselves on the stage, and we'd sing the song and we'd get off and people would clap politely, right? But we looked and we said, wait a minute, there's potential here to actually put on a full rock concert. And what if when that kid gets up there, they're the guitar for Green Day, but it's the whole band. And it's not just them getting up there by themselves with their teacher who they already know. Now all of a sudden they're meeting somebody who's a drummer who they never met before, and a bass player, and we're putting the whole thing together. So and it's no exaggeration to say that you might show up at this place knowing nothing about the guitar, and 2 months later be on stage playing your favorite Green Day song with a full rock band, full PA, the whole stage, the lights, everything, right? An audience cheering you on. And the other musicians in that group are all seasoned musicians. So you're not playing with other people at your level that maybe everybody's sort of unstable and not sure where to lead yet. You're actually playing in a group where you're being featured, but you're being really, really carefully held by this group of musicians who know what they're doing. And so for a while, we were doing that, and our staff were doing all the work. And so our weeks would be, you're going along, and then all of a sudden, oh, there's a recital next week, there's a concert next week. Now all of a sudden I have to learn and rehearse 15 songs over the next week and have them ready to get on stage. And I can't make a mistake because we got one run through. We do rehearsal at 5:30 and the show at 7. So you got one run through with everybody just to see what it was like. It wasn't really a practice. It was really just for the student to experience, oh, this is what this is like. So they're not literally experiencing it for the first time on stage, And so two things were happening from that. We were noticing both things at the same time. The diagnostic element that you're talking about is we had all these students who were becoming really good musicians, but they were all kind of doing their own thing. They were off on their own, doing their own thing, and they were playing in bands with other people. And I would get my students would be complaining to me all the time, like, yeah, I've started this band, but like this, the bass player doesn't know what he's doing, and the drummer never listens, and we're arguing all the time, and we're like not really getting anywhere, right? So I'm like, okay, so you've got this personal skill that you're developing, and that's going really well, but that's only half the story in music, right? Like a lot of us, when we get into it, we get better, we want to play with people. And so I was seeing all these kids going out there, they're 15, 16, 17, really good musicians, but they don't know how to foster the band with others. And so I looked at that, and then I looked at on the other hand, the insane hours that me and the other music instructors were working during concert weeks when we had to learn 15 extra songs. Like we were literally pulling 15-hour days sometimes to get everything ready. And we're like, this isn't sustainable. And so we invited all these students who were more advanced musicians, and we said, hey, we want to give you a chance to be part of the backing band. And we're going to invite you in, and you're going to be in the backing band. But now listen, this isn't for you. You're now showing up to play, and you're backing up the other student. You have to make sure that this is about that student. So you need to learn this song perfectly, and you need to show up and be able to nail it the first time, guaranteed. Right? So that's a lot of pressure. Like all of a sudden you're showing up, and your level of preparation is going to determine whether this other student's experience is positive. Right? So we made it real for them. But then on top of that, they had to come in and they had to volunteer, and they had to volunteer their time. And we taught them a bunch of other teamwork principles and different values that they had to espouse when they got there. And we actually built, I never called it an acorn, but we built an acorn. We built that same team around the production of the concert itself. So these students were showing up early. They were helping set up the stage. They were welcoming people in. We had all the roles, and then people had to play all the roles. We always started every gathering with gratitude. We always ended with an appreciation circle after the concert, right? And what happened was incredible, because not only did the load get lightened for the instructors, and we all started having more fun, but all of a sudden, these kids who before were really frustrated by the experience of playing with others, all of a sudden got super inspired by it. And they were all looking forward to those recitals. And they ended up being like the highlight of everybody's month, you know? And then that was the group that we had 7 kids accepted to Berklee School of Music in the same year.
Wow.
Right. And what they had all done is they had all gone through that process of being part of the backing band for 3 years. And at the end of that, they're going off and graduating. They all got accepted into music college. And it was just really, really incredible. And it actually even led to us starting an international expedition that was based on the same principles, where we actually built a band that would then go and tour in Spain for 3 weeks every summer. And we, I could get into the details of it, but this structure that we're talking about, these 8 shields principles, and the acorn structure, and all of the things, the natural flow cycle, all of it was informing my design. But then also we were always kind of asking, how is it going? And I taught my staff to ask those questions of how are we doing, how are we going, through these lenses, right? Again, I never brought up 8 shields. I never brought these things up. I never mentioned a direction or it was just sort of, this is what we need, everybody, and it was really incredible, really incredible to see what it did. And I think one of the things that I just want to highlight from it is that it wasn't just that people were getting better. It was that they were getting better and they were having a blast. Because there's a lot, you can definitely go through a really rigorous training program that will prepare you for music school, but is it going to be fun? I don't know, and I felt like we were managing to pull off both of those things. And that was, I'm really, really grateful for that. And I definitely give a lot of credit to these principles.
Does that satisfy your question, Sarah?
Yeah, that is just such an amazing story. I love that the selfless service, right? The service to others became the motivating principle, the inspiration and the motivation to create the focus, right? For that deeper learning. And I'm feeling like there's a piece in there, to get a person to a place where that is naturally motivating, helping other people. So I think that the container in general that you were holding was fostering that natural, I want to help out, right? That natural generosity and giving back. So I know that is built into the model. And you could probably speak to it specifically. I don't know if we have time for that today, but.
Well, I think the only thing I will say is that it was I would say a little bit of a stroke of genius by my mentor and the founder of the organization, because he basically said, I don't care how people feel about it. That's going to be a requirement. And so it was required. But then what happens is, once you get into it and you're part of the experience, you realize how good it feels. And then those students would over time evolve into sort of leading with those thoughts of service. Right. But it didn't necessarily happen. Some students it did. It happened right away, although I think I could probably point to a lot of those students had something else culturally in their lives, whether it was their family or their religious background or something, where they already had a sense of service. Right. I think if I looked, I would say that was probably a common thread, that some students were already kind of tuned for service, but those that weren't, They learned it through the process. And even, even though I think, if we're being frank, some of them were just basically motivated by, I want to play with my friends. And that was the thing that was there, is like, oh, that kid that I think is really cool, well, he's part of this, and I want to go and play with him because he's a good drummer. So now I'm going to go and participate. And then he kind of comes in through the back door, and you start to realize, oh, this actually is the deal. Right. And, and you walk away. I think that was the other piece of it, was that it came in through the back door, but then at the end, a lot of students, that didn't go on to become professional musicians. They went on to get degrees and other things, or go off to live their lives in other ways. But their reflections would be, I thought the music was the thing, but then it turned out the music, it actually didn't matter what song I was playing. I didn't, I would have all these opinions about whether I liked that song or whatever in the beginning. And by the end, the only thing I cared about was just experiencing the joy that people were having when we were playing for them. Right. Or seeing the joy of that student that I was supporting. Right. And seeing them light up at the end when when the audience cheers. Right. So, yeah. So, and I think I think that is an 8 Shields principle, very much a Coyote teaching principle, right? You weren't going to sit at your sit spot, but you'd practice camping. Well, the kid's not going to be in service, but he wants to play with the cool drummer. So there you go. Next thing you know, it comes in through the back door.
Yeah, I love that. So just to kind of look back on what Aidan just shared with us, he talked about his vision, which is to get everyone to love music, right? Or the people that he's working with to love music. And then he's also distilling out for each of those individuals what their vision is. So we're starting in that pre-dawn, zero phase, so to speak. 1 is inspiration, that's sunrise time. 2 is motivation, that's mid-morning, whenever all the birds want to move around and the deer are moving around, right? And then that midday time, when it's getting hot and it's getting, oh, this is tough, that's when you got to focus. That's learning the chords, learning the scales, right? Then there's that period where it becomes embodied, it becomes natural, which is that mid-afternoon phase. And then comes the sunset, and that's when everyone gathers for the celebration. And this is where service lives. So there was actually several layers of service in that sunset west period of your use of the cycle. There was the celebration of the kid that was featured, but then there was the celebration of service by the ones who were the peers ahead, right? So you had layers there. And we'll, in the masterclass, we talk about how these principles show up with different layers in different ways. So there's some really good design there, Aidan. And then I think the one that you haven't mentioned, which is that twilight, okay, so the celebration's over. You did say at the end of that, you always gathered everyone and had an appreciation circle. So that's that moment of reflection that you had said early at the beginning of this. And did that go to that midnight principle where the wisdom kicks in? I mean, it sounds like it did, but I think a lot of that was coming through you and your team. But the one takeaway that those young people had, oh, I left this music program and I tried to start a band, but nobody knew what they were doing, right? And did that come home to them after that? Then they were able to then more ably inspire others and mentor others to actually form, good dynamics and pull a band together.
Yeah, and the way that we approached that was through having the different layers of rings, right? The different layers of sort of responsibility. And when we started doing the summer expeditions to Spain, that's when it really took off, because the program itself required an application process and an audition process, and there was a lot of inherent trips around the wheel, so to speak, right, through the cycle, or just to be ready for it. And then usually what would happen is students would finish their first year of that, and then they would realize, well, gosh, now that I've done it once, now I think I understand how I should have done it the first time. And so then they would go back through the second time. And, we would invite students to come back a second year, but in the second year, their responsibility was to the well-being of the entire group. So we actually built in that they were then responsible for the new students and responsible for that student layer, because it's also true that the instructors are going to somewhat be the parents, and whatever the instructors say, they're going to rebel a little bit. They're not really going to listen, but they're going to listen to their peers, especially the ones that they look up to. So in that second year, students were responsible for that. And I think that was where the deepening of the wisdom really started to come from. There was a lot of reflection and sort of integration and this conversation very explicitly around, okay, what is it that you got from year one that you wish you could do better in year two, right? What are the ways in which you want to, what do you want more of? What do you want to change? What do you want to transform, right? Very much that reflection and renewal and kind of resetting of the vision in that second go around. And in that same way, we did little mini versions of that with the students that were participating in the monthly concerts.
Beautiful.
Right? Little mini versions, and sometimes those conversations were very short because sometimes they're basically just, yep, great job, let's keep going, more of that, but sometimes it was a more specific conversation around, being able to be more welcoming or, what have you, right? Little details and ways that we can improve. And keeping in touch with those students over the years, they have had a lot of success as being good bandmates, as you might imagine. So and that's to me, that feels like as much of a victory as anything, because most of us are not going to become professional musicians, even if music is a big part of our life, but we're all going to be parts of a team, and being able to learn these skills to be good team members and help strengthen your team, that's just invaluable.
No, that's great. Well, that's about all the time we have here today, folks. And we'll have a deeper conversation that you'll find someday when we'll get into some more specifics when we get further down the journey with the H-Shields Masterclass, because you're going to kind of want to go back and listen to this podcast all over again to see the layers that Aidan's hinting at right now. But I think you've done a fantastic job of showing just the basics of that natural learning cycle and ways to apply it. And you hinted at other layers, which we'll get to later in another podcast. But thanks for that so much, Aidan. Sarah, any reflections on the way out here?
Yeah, just really appreciate the real life application, in such a vivid, conscious and experience and description, but also the real world effectiveness, right? Like having those students go on to get accepted to the Berklee School of Music is really amazing, right? And just illustrates how, designing with natural cycles is like what brings us to our genius, right? What brings us to a place of not only enjoying ourselves and getting along and having fun, but like truly in that place of creative genius that's impactful and shows up in the world. So this has just been a brilliant conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you both. It's really a pleasure to get to share about this.
Yeah.
Loved it. Looking for more. All right. Take care, everybody. Till next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening to Tracking Connections. You can find everything related to the podcast and our current offerings at trackingconnections.net. We'll see you next time.